Natalie came through one of those suggestions. You know, they were like, we need somebody to talk about vulnerability and empathy for us. And so I went out and researched across the United States to find the best that we can to deliver that for us. And so Natalie was a great suggestion, and really appreciate our organizations wanting to kick off the year with this important topic. Natalie's the co-founder and chief visionary of Vital Solutions, a forward-thinking organization focused on helping companies transform their cultures through improved well-being, team dynamics, and courageous leadership. She has over 30 years experience working with organizations globally to create strategies and trainings that improve company productivity, prevent burnout, and align well-being to purpose. She has extensive experience working with healthcare systems, executive leadership, federal government, and women's leadership. Some of her clients include Johnson & Johnson, the Singapore healthcare system, Ascensions Healthcare, Advent Health, Novo Nordisk, Deloitte, U.S. Air Force, and a variety of municipalities and nonprofit organizations across the United States. Her background is in exercise physiology, performance nutrition, and performance psychology, setting the foundation for how behavior changes can have significant impact on performance as long as there is a connection to meaningful purpose. She's an industry-recognized performance coach, a certified Dare to Lead facilitator, and emotional well-being coach. She's described by her clients and audiences as having a contagious energy, personable, generous, creative. Natalie is a natural extrovert and especially talented in getting people to turn thoughts into actions. She loves the challenge of meeting new people, breaking the ice, and creating connection. She currently resides in Lakewood Ranch, Florida, with her husband, 2 sons, and their dog, Princess Leia. Isn't that great? Well, I'll ask the women at the back on Zoom to go ahead and make sure that everyone online has the materials that Natalie has for us that we're going to be working through today, and I will turn it over to Natalie. So welcome to the year of Executive Learning Networks. Thanks, Natalie, for being with us. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And let's not talk about me anymore. That was a long bio. And who knew Princess Leia was in my introduction? Welcome, everyone. Super excited to be here today, especially in person. I want to welcome everyone virtually as well. Like Jill said, my name is Natalie Johnson. I live in Florida, and I spend most of my time in different countries and different states working with different organizations on what I call as organizational well-being. Before I define what that actually is, I just want to set up kind of some expectations for this morning. And so this morning is going to be interactive, in person and online. I really want to encourage all of you, you can eat, you can snack, you can drink. I want to encourage you to not sit on your butt and just listen to me, but get up out of your seat, move around, stretch. I will be incorporating what I like to call is strategic movement into our day. When we move, it sends a signal to our body to create energy. And energy is the foundation for being engaged. So as a strategy of keeping you engaged here today, I'm going to get you moving up out of your chair. You will be writing. So there are some worksheets. I believe in pen to paper for learning experiences. We know that when we take pen to paper as opposed to typing or texting, that there is a deeper connection to the brain. So as you're writing your reflections and your thoughts and everything that you're thinking about today, you are more likely to remember it, and you're more likely to make a behavior change if you wrote it instead of typing it. So I want to encourage you to just take notes. You don't have to write just for the activities that we're doing in here, but if anything stands out to you and you think, oh, that's good, I could maybe use that, write it down. The expectation is not that you'll remember everything I talk about today and then take all of it with you and bring it back to your company. The real expectation is that you take one thing. We know in behavior change research that we as humans are not good at sustaining change unless we only start with one thing. So by the end of today, I'm going to be asking you about your one big thing. What is one thing that you learned today that you'll be able to take back and use with your teams and implement confidently and successfully? And so we're going to be talking about everything from what vulnerability is to what that looks like in the workplace and how to use that with empathy through things like tough conversations. And so as we move through the content, again, I'm going to get you up and moving and working at your tables. And one of the first things that I want to make sure we do this morning is establish an environment where you as participants and as my audience can truly be present here today. So I'm going to introduce you to your first tool and strategy of the day, which is called permission slips. Permission slips are exactly what it sounds like. What do you need to give yourself permission to do, not do, or think in order to be truly present here with me today? And so it might be something as simple as I need to give myself permission to not look at my phone while I'm here. I need to give myself permission to truly be present and not think about what I'm missing at work. I need to give myself permission to be a learner instead of an expert. Whatever works for you today in this moment, I want you to give yourself a permission slip. And so those online, once you've completed yours, if you could type into the chat what your permission slips are for the day. Now, once you've given yourself at least one permission slip to be here today, I want you to stand up so I know you're done. So one of my strategies today in making sure that you have enough time to reflect and think is I'm going to be asking you to stand up when you are done. So Craig or Charlie, do we have any online permission slips? Is Charlie back there? I can't even see. Sarah's back there.
All right. So some of our online permission slips are to be fully present, to not check emails while they're here, to not check emails and turn off notifications, focus time, do not disturb status, and not multitasking.
Thank you, Sarah. That's helpful. So what I want to do here in the room is I want all of you at your table to face each other. So you're looking at each other at your table. Listen closely. On the count of three, I want you to point to someone at your table. 1, 2, 3. I want you to look at who got the most points. Who got the most points? Put your hand up. Okay, so the people with your hand up, you are your team leaders for the day. Team leader, your job responsibility is to just summarize the conversation at the table. And when I call on the table, just give back to the bigger group what that conversation was like. Were there any themes? But here's the trick. Team leaders, as leaders, you have the opportunity to delegate at any time. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to introduce just a little bit of vulnerability here this morning, because in order to learn about vulnerability, we have to be vulnerable. So I want you to share with your table what your permission slips are for today. So take a moment to share with your table. What are your permission slips? All right, so team leaders, we're going to ask you to summarize. We're not going to call on all the tables yet. But I would love to hear what some of the permission slips are, because it's also helpful for me. So I think I'm going to start with this table back here. Who's our leader back here? Oh, Montana's our leader. What are the permission slips, Montana?
And then another one was don't problem solve like outside tasks, like think about outside tasks going on right now and try to like think about that. And then another one was don't think about today's to-do list.
Yeah. So I heard a lot of don't think about what's going on outside of this room necessarily while we're in the room. And then I know one for me also is don't even look at my phone because it calls to me sometimes. Okay.
For us, it was because it's early morning. There's a lot of stuff going on at the house. So with house guests and kids and dogs, that was one. And then for Chris and I, it was about all the stuff that we didn't do or supposed to be doing. And so it's the task items that pop up and creep into the mind and you just think about it as opposed to focusing on the speaker.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Rob. And let's go to this table over here.
Yeah, so we had similar themes. We have all women at our table, just happens to be. So I think some good multitaskers, but we had talked about distractions with the phones and also with the rest of the day, what's coming down the pike, to just kind of let all that go. But another theme at our table was to not feel like we have to remember everything from this morning and just kind of take away that one thing. So not feel like we have to perfectly digest all of that information.
Thank you. And our last table.
Rounding it up. Similar to everyone else, we talked a lot about not thinking about what's next or what's on your to-do list, not checking your phone, and being willing to be honest and show up more vulnerably. So pretty on point with the theme, even without hearing it. So
Right. Thank you. Well, and I think it's interesting because I think, the theme that I hear from each table is that I'm going to give myself permission to truly be present and thinking in the moment, which is mindfulness, being in the moment. And we, especially over the last couple of years, have begun to train our brain to not be in the moment and always thinking ahead or always thinking behind. And when we're doing that, we are distracted. And so what you just learned, this simple permission slips tool, is a tool that supports trust among teams. It's a tool that if we can all be vulnerable, even for just a few minutes, it creates connection among the group, because then we see each other. Yes, me too. I see you. And so as we go through this training today, there might be some times where some of you are thinking, oh, not used to talking about that in a professional setting, not used to talking about that at work, and you might feel a little bit uncomfortable. It might feel like a little bit of emotional exposure, which is vulnerability. And I want to encourage you today to lean into that discomfort. And maybe if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable about the conversation or what we're saying, to lean in and say it anyway. Why would I do that? Why would I want you to lean into that discomfort? What do you think happens in that moment or during those uncomfortable conversations? Absolutely. You become uncomfortable, and we need discomfort to grow. It's like looking at stress. We need stress in order to become more resilient. And so it's during those moments that we actually learn, that we actually grow, and where other people begin to truly see us. That is where connection happens, because once one person opens the door to being a little bit vulnerable, it opens the door for the rest of the group to truly share and show up as themselves. So you can sit down. I will have you standing up and sitting down. And again, I want to encourage you, you can stand to the side of the room. You can move around and stretch and do whatever you need to do. And so this small tool of permission slips only takes a few seconds. It's something that you can do with your own teams, and it supports psychological safety. Have you heard of psychological safety? Do you know what it is? So psychological safety is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So psychological safety means I can show up to work and feel very safe about saying things like, oh, I'm not sure what's going on, I don't understand, or I don't have the answer. It means that I can show up truly as myself and share, even though sometimes I fear other people might judge me. And psychological safety is kind of a new term. We learned about it from Google. So Google, probably about 6 years ago, did a study specifically looking at their own teams, because what they noticed was we have some teams that are high performing teams. They're very effective, performance is very high, they work really well together. Then we have these other teams within Google, not so much. They don't seem to perform as well. They don't meet deliverables as well. And they wanted to figure out what's the difference. What's the difference between our high performing teams versus our teams that are not high performing? And the number one thing that showed up across all high performing teams was psychological safety. That the teams that perform at the highest rate had a very high level of psychological safety. They were able to feel comfortable in having tough conversations. They trusted each other. They recognized their value on the team, and they weren't scared to jump into vulnerability. And so a big part of what we're going to be talking today about vulnerability and empathy is all strategies that support creating this psychological safety among teams, essentially creating more trust among teams. And so what's really interesting about psychological safety and what I've learned in my career is that it doesn't necessarily have to be something that comes from executive level down. It's something that actually happens more on the individual teams. And the way it happens is actually pretty simple. It's by people saying things like, I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. I made a mistake, or I just don't understand. And so in situations where we don't understand, or we made a mistake, it can feel really vulnerable to step up and say that because we're afraid of perceptions of other people, what they might think, and they might judge us. But when we choose to step into our vulnerability instead and say these things, we open the door for other people to feel comfortable as well. And the likelihood that someone else doesn't understand, or the likelihood that someone else has made a mistake or will make a mistake is very, very high. And so when we can openly talk about mistakes, about vulnerability, about the things that we don't know, we then allow for more trust. We then allow for more connection and real relationships. And that's where the teams grow. Other things that you can do as leaders that increase psychological safety. Well, let's pause there for a minute, because I would actually love to hear from you. So at your tables, I would like you to have just a quick discussion. What are some other things, other than saying things like this? What are some other things that you could do on your own teams that would increase trust and psychological safety of your team? So I'm going to give you about 2-3 minutes to discuss that at your table. What are some things that you do now or you could do that would increase trust and psychological safety of your team? And it will require some vulnerability. So 2 to 3 minute discussion. Oh yeah, absolutely. And people online, please put it in the chat. And I'll say that up front now that when we do our group activities in the room, that's going to be your expectation online each time to go in the chat, and I'll remind you. All right, so let's bring it back together. And I would love to hear from some of our teams what you came up with, but let's start with our people online. I'm going to be starting with people online so I don't forget them out there.
All right, so some of our answers for how you can increase trust and psychological safety on your team are ask about challenges, transparency, saying thank you, conduct retrospectives, encouraging by actually thanking people who show vulnerability in front of others, and admitting when you're wrong, owning up to mistakes.
Thank you. And I love that, thanking other people when they show vulnerability in front of the team. I really like that one a lot. Let's start with our team back here. Who's our leader? I forget. Yes.
We talked. Am I on?
You are.
We talked about a few different things that either we already do or that we could do. One that I thought was really interesting was executive overnights, where it's kind of like off-site meeting sort of. And so there's meetings involved, but there's also a lot of downtime where folks get to know each other better and spend time and get an idea of who each other is outside of work. We talked about asking for advice about, as a leader, recognizing other people's strengths and relying on people who maybe are lower on the hierarchy, but have something that they can really offer, showing that you think they're maybe better at a certain aspect of something. And then I guess just asking other people how things make them feel, or being open to other people's stuff.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the things you said that stands out to me is the executive retreat. I can remember when I was first in the workforce a long time ago, there was this expectation that home stays at home. You don't bring home things in personal life to work. We keep it separate. I mean, and that's impossible today. Work and life are very much integrated. And it absolutely is a benefit to get to know people a little bit beyond work. We don't overshare, but get to know what's going on in people's lives and connect to what really matters to them. We'll go to this table. Thank you, Montana. And how about this group? Oh, Andrea's been delegated.
Real close, Andrea. We're trying to make sure that those online can hear us and are having a little bit of. So we talked about some similar things, I think, that have already been mentioned. But in addition, leading with vulnerability. If you don't know, be the first to say, I don't know, in front of your teams or in front of other folks, to set the tone that it is okay. We also talked about triangulation, and if there is a concern or a question or an issue with something, that you go directly to the person that involves rather than going to somebody else to help build trust. And then just really just being focused on the people and getting to know them, and leading from that space to make a personal connection for that foundation of trust.
Thank you. And These are all great suggestions. And I think they all bring with them a little bit of discomfort in being able to do these things, because we get stopped by our fear and our fear of the expectations of other people, or what they might say or what they might do. And what we know, because interestingly enough, we have research and data on vulnerability, and the way that we measure courage is by the amount of vulnerability that is present. And so although vulnerability can feel scary, it can feel like weakness, it can feel like emotional exposure, when we see it in other people, it looks like courage. And courage is contagious. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Brene Brown's work? She works in, lots of people. I never know what to expect, because sometimes I get no one that raises their hand, and other times everyone does. So if you don't know who Dr. Brene Brown is, she has spent her last 20 years studying vulnerability, courage, emotional literacy, and empathy in leadership. And I have the opportunity to work with Brene, and I've learned a lot from her. I originally was introduced to her work when I was teaching and training on empathy, and she had done a lot of work on empathy. And today I have the opportunity to facilitate for her and her Dare to Lead curriculum. And what we know is there are skill sets of courage, and all skill sets of courage require some vulnerability. So we define, in daring leadership, we define a leader as someone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and has the courage to develop that potential. And when I think in my own career about different leaders that I've had, and who was the most courageous, and who was the person that really leaned into growing my potential, what I'm reminded of is one of my supervisors. His name was Eric, and I used to work for San Diego State University for about 15 years. And he was my supervisor there. And I was young, I was in my late 20s. And in my role, and this happens a lot, I was really good at my job. And because I was good at my job, they promoted me into a leadership position, but with no leadership training. And so I all of a sudden went from being responsible for myself to now you're responsible for 125 students. And as you might guess, students, especially in their first job, there's all kinds of performance issues. Everything from people coming in late to finding people sleeping in the closets to all kinds of stuff. And so I would go to Eric and just not even know what to do with this or how to have the conversation. And the one thing that stands out to me about Eric, and he was my supervisor for years, was he never told me what to do. And in some moments that was frustrating. Some moments it was frustrating because I just wanted him to tell me what to do. I didn't know what to do. But what he would do instead is he would say, wow, Natalie, what do you think great looks like in this situation? What does great look like for you? Or he would say, how could you use your strengths to solve this problem? Or Natalie, you seem really creative to me. Could you be creative in coming up with a solution for this? And how could I support you? And what he was doing, and he always asked me questions. He never told me what to do. And in between all the questions that he would ask me about what's going on in life. He would ask me about how I feel about different situations, different initiatives, different things that the schools were doing. And so looking back on my career, like Eric was that one that taught me so much. He pushed me to really seek within myself what I was trying to create and find my path to doing it. And what's really interesting is the reason I left San Diego State University, when I think back, I loved that job. I learned so much, but we grew very big within the department, and another supervisor came in, and I was no longer reporting to Eric. And the new supervisor said things like, Natalie, you should do this, and you should do that, and you should think about doing this. I do a lot of emotional well-being coaching, and what we call that shoulding all over someone. And when you should all over someone, you make them feel like crap. You're making them feel like you are inferior to them. And even today, just saying the word should, it's a no-no in coaching. It makes me go, oh, but that's what he used to always say to me. You should, you're shoulding all over someone. And it made me feel like he didn't respect me. It made me feel like I was serving his agenda. And I remember thinking back there in my head, every time he would talk to me, I would say, what does he think, he's my dad or something? It just evoked this resistance in me. And I ultimately left. And many of you probably know the number one reason why people leave their jobs is they're their supervisor, their boss. And so this definition really describes Eric, and I love how it emphasizes that he had the courage to develop my potential. It never felt like his agenda. And so one of the quotes, if you're familiar with Dr. Brene Brown, one of the quotes that she uses a lot comes from Theodore Roosevelt. And here is that quote. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly." So in courageous leadership, we use this quote, we call this the arena quote. The arena represents where we go when we're being courageous. And what it really represents is that as leaders, sometimes we might not feel comfortable in saying or doing things, and we know a decision that we have to make is going to require some vulnerability. And we recognize that we can't control what other people think. We can't control what other people are going to say. And we might fail, but I'm going to step into the arena and I'm going to do it anyway, because we believe in being courageous as leaders and creating that connection with other people. And so when you step into the arena, it's not about necessarily winning. It's about being the person that instead of being reactive and stepping back and not saying anything, or being reactive and saying maybe the wrong thing and speaking and behaving out of anger, but I'm going to think through and say the thing or do the thing that aligns with my values and my integrity. And not everyone is going to be in the arena with us, and we can't control the outcome, but we're going to choose to do it anyway. And I love this quote. We refer to it a lot in Daring Leadership. You can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And if any of you can think of something you've done in your life that was courageous, it would have required vulnerability, which is why it is courageous. And so what I want to do next is, one of the things that I've learned about human behavior is that a lot of times we don't have the most appropriate motivator in place in order for us to make behavior change in our life. In other words, sometimes, especially in my line of work, people will say, well, I want to be a better leader, so I'm going to go do this thing, or I'm going to be vulnerable because I want to be a better leader. Or I'm going to try and learn to have tough conversations to be a better leader. Or maybe it's something as simple as, I'm going to start exercising because I want to be healthier. I'm going to eat better. I'm going to get better sleep. There's all these things out there that we know we could do, and it would make us a better leader, or it would make us healthier. It doesn't mean we actually do them. And one of the reasons that we don't actually do everything that we think about is because we don't always have the most appropriate motivator in place. In other words, health is not a great motivator of behavior change. It's just not. We all know we'd be healthier if we did certain things. Doesn't mean that we do it. Being a good leader, that statement in general, the broad statement of I want to be a better leader, is not specific enough to always motivate us to make behavior change. And so what I'm going to be focusing on next is creating what I like to call is a new internal navigation system. A new way of creating navigation so that you can create some clarity on something that's really powerful and meaningful to you as an individual leader. And I call this your best self vision, or your best self as a leader. And so in your worksheet, you have some questions. This is question number 2. My best self vision as a courageous leader. When I am my best self as a leader, how do I manage my team? How do I treat others? How do I live into my values? So before you do this activity, I just want to give you a little bit more on this. I call this an internal navigation system because it's really important for us to clarify our destination, the place we want to go. When our destination is, I want to be healthier, or our destination is, I want to be a courageous leader, what does that mean in real life? There's not enough detail, there's not enough clarity around it, and we haven't connected that to what's meaningful and valuable to us. And so this internal navigation system activity that I'm taking you through is going to create clarity on purpose. It's going to create clarity on how you actually want to show up and for whom deserves that version of you. And so your best self vision creates some clarity around purpose. It creates that North Star for you, but it's also important to identify, okay, so who and what actually deserves that best self from me? So the first step to this process is an open journaling activity. So you see the questions on your worksheet, and you can certainly use those. Those are meant to be prompting questions. They are not questions that you answer all of them. They are meant to be prompting questions. When you think of you as the best version of yourself as a courageous leader, what does that mean? How do you speak? How do you communicate? How do you show up as a leader? How do you show up as a parent, a friend, a partner? How do you want others to describe you? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to journal about that and create your own best self vision. So what you have in front of you is this, you've created more clarity on what best self looks like. When best self shows up, this is what this courageous leader looks like. What's really important, so now that we've created some clarity on best self, this is our destination. This is what we want showing up. It's really important to take a step back and kind of face the truth. In other words, when does that person show up? If you think about your own life, in the last year, personally and professionally, what percentage of the time has that best self shown up? And go ahead and give yourself a percentage. And people online, I would love to see, you guys are anonymous. I would love to hear from you what your percentages are. So you can go into the chat online and share some of your percentages. What do we have online? Is it still Sarah back there?
We're just getting answers coming through now, but we have 75% and 80%, a lot of 80%.
Those are high. Good job online. Anyone have anything different in the room? And I think here in the room, we're getting some head shakes that yes, we have some different numbers, and yes, there is opportunity for improvement. So this best self vision is a way to step into and really live into our purpose, because best self vision is a behavioral manifestation of purpose. What that means is when you show up as the best version of yourself, that is you living with purpose. And so there might be some opportunities for improvement. Is the expectation that it should be 100% of the time? Best self, 100% of the time? No, it is not. It is not realistic. But more importantly, does everyone deserve best self? I don't either. And so I want you to think, first of all right, well, who does? Who are the people and things that deserve best self? And who are the people and things that don't? So I'm not saying they deserve worse self. What I'm saying is there are people and things in our life that are really important to us at work, at home, and those people deserve best self. But there might be other people and things in our life that are getting our energy and our time, and they aren't on our list. And maybe we could use some of this data to create some boundaries around where we choose to give our energy and our time and our best self. Because unfortunately, what can happen, and what is most common with many of us, is that we give our time and energy so much to other things that when we get home or we're engaging with the people and things that matter most, sometimes they don't get best self. So I just want you to take a couple notes on that, just your thoughts on that. Who are the people and things that deserve best self, and who are the people and things that don't? Maybe the people and things that you're giving your time and energy to, that you could begin to create some boundaries. So this is just a reflection. There's not a specific question. You can write it in the notes on your worksheet. So as we're thinking through who deserves best self in our life and how might we increase that percentage that we gave to ourselves, it's going to take a little bit of courage and likely some tough conversations here and there. Tough conversations around creating boundaries around the places where we're giving time and energy, but also maybe some tough conversations around things like work and life integration, and maybe reasons why we haven't been giving best self to the things and the people that matter. And so where we're going next is I want you to think today about a specific call to courage that you might have in your life. And so your call to courage does not have to be anything big, but where is a place in your life where you could lean into vulnerability, and possibly make some changes in your life that would help you show up as best self more often for the people and things that matter. So there are some examples on your worksheet. Some of the things that you could be braver around and be more vulnerable. I want to be braver around giving constructive criticism or hard conversations. I want to create better work-life integration. That would create some tough conversations around creating boundaries. I want to be brave in having more tough conversations, speaking up when I'm uncertain. So these are not big things, but where in your life as a leader could you benefit from being a little bit more vulnerable and courageous? And write your thoughts down. When you feel like you have a really good call to courage that you want to start with, again, you're not committing to doing this yet. This is brainstorming, thinking about what your call to courage might be. It won't be until the end till you identify that one big thing that you're actually going to do. But when you feel like you have a good idea, stand up so I know you're done. I want you to continue to think about that best self vision that you created. If you were to make any changes, if you were to lean into this call to courage that you've set for yourself, how would that support best self? And how does empathy fit? Empathy is also, as leaders, when you lead with empathy, that's not only leading with some vulnerability, but it's also courageous leadership, and it helps us to further understand others. And so one of the things that you might completely fully be aware of, but might not, is that we as human beings are very reactive. We have a natural tendency to react very quickly whenever we experience high energy, negative emotions. So if a person irritates us, the likelihood of us behaving like we're irritated is very, very high. If we're angry, we act angry. If we're irritated, impatient, we act irritated, impatient. That is very natural. That is very easy. That happens without even thinking. And that has to do with our survival mechanism, the fight or flight system. And that happens in situations where our body triggers fight or flight, but it's not a life or death situation. It's just someone that triggered us or created irritation with us. But it's in those moments that we say or do things that we later might regret, right? Might regret. And so, did I say it right? Might regret. I put a W in there somewhere. And it's through that reactivity that we need to create some self-awareness, because when we lead with that reactivity, that comes back to what I like to refer to as the old school command and control. You just should do this. This is where we made the mistake. This is where you need to do better. And when we lead with command and control, we're leading with fear. And the unfortunate thing is command and control leadership actually works. You can scare people into doing what you want, but it's not sustainable, and you walk all over your people. And so empathy comes in because it is a way to truly lead with people instead of leading over them. And it means that we need to be self-aware on our reactivity, what we're feeling, and how that's going to impact our behavior, and how we have the ability to make a different choice, which means pause and lead differently, lead with vulnerability and lead with connection. And so where I'm going to go next is we're going to get into empathy and how that plays a part in leading with. So you can sit down. You don't have to stay standing up. You can move around. You don't have to sit in your chairs either. And I'm going to apply empathy specifically to hard conversations for today, because I think for a lot of us, we might have hard conversations in our life. There's likely hard conversations related to that call to courage that we just journaled about. But it's a really easy way to begin, if you haven't already, to practice empathy on a regular basis. And so empathy, oftentimes when I have different groups and I say, well, what is empathy? And somebody in the room will say, it means you step into the shoes of the other person. And that's not really what empathy is, because in many cases, you haven't been in their shoes. That person has experienced something that you've never experienced, or that person has done something that you don't understand at all, because you would have never done that. And so it's not being in their shoes. Empathy is about being able to sync up to the emotion that they're feeling. And something that has been really valuable for me and new in research around empathy and emotions is that we now know that we do not have the ability as human beings to identify emotion in other people. And for me, that's a little bit groundbreaking because I do a lot of emotional intelligence training. And some of my clients have me take an emotional intelligence assessment because my audience took it and they want me to see the assessment. And you know what the assessment is? It's a bunch of pictures of people like making a face. What's that? Anger, and I'm supposed to name the emotion. We don't have the ability to do that. We do not have the ability as humans to identify emotion in other people. Therefore, we must use our language to be able to identify and sync up and recognize the emotion. And so empathy is being able to use our language so then we can seek to understand and recognize what that emotion is and sync up to it. Because somebody might, so let's say in professional life, you're having a conversation about feedback around performance, and the person keeps doing something over and over and over, and you don't understand, and you would have never done that. And so leading with empathy is tell me about how this situation is going. I'm really curious. I want to learn what's happening for you. How do you feel about this situation? And then saying back to them something like, well, you sound really mad. And they might say, yes, I'm really mad. Or they might say, no, I'm not mad. I'm embarrassed. And that's our ability now to create some empathy because we know the difference between mad versus embarrassed. And we've been embarrassed in our life. Then we're able to sync up and truly understand. And so empathy creates innovation, collaboration, and creativity in the workplace. When we feel understood and we recognize that other people are connecting to what we're feeling, we're more likely to work better together. Empathy is taking the perspective of the other person. So that means being generous in your interpretation of them, coming into a conversation and recognizing I might not know the whole story. There might be details that I still need to know. So taking their perspective, seeking to understand their perspective, staying out of judgment. So staying out of judgment can be really hard. And what I've learned in some of the research around shame and vulnerability is that we tend to be more judgmental about people who are doing something that is a shame trigger for us. So for example, for me, I sometimes will be more judgmental in my personal life. And so I might be more judgmental in my head mostly, but judgmental about friends that I have who are stay-at-home moms and all their kids are grown and off to school. And they talk about how busy they are. And in my head, I'm judgmental because I have 2 kids and I have one that's looking for college and I work full time and my husband's in law enforcement. And in my head, I'm thinking, what are they doing all day that's making them busy? And what that really comes back to is I struggled a lot as a mom in deciding whether or not to be a stay-at-home mom or a working mom. And I had some shame around that. And I've never been a stay-at-home mom, but there's some shame there for me where I feel like maybe I should have been home. Maybe I should have spent more time with my kids. And so isn't it interesting that where I tend to be the most judgy is stay-at-home moms? And so that's just my example of, wow, that really connected for me where I can be more clear around where I tend to be more judgmental and why. And it helps me to seek to better understand and be able to take their perspective and lead with open-ended questions instead of being judgmental. Recognizing emotion, that means we're going to have to ask some questions because remember, we can't recognize emotion without asking questions and having them identify what emotion they are feeling. And then finally, communicating that recognition. And so I want to share with you a short video. This is from Brene Brown. This is from one of the trainings that she did where she talked about empathy and sympathy and the difference. It talks about these 4 aspects of empathy, but they've taken her training and put it on a cartoon. And I think it does a really good job of really describing what empathy is and what it isn't.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, Not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I had it, yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So oftentimes, when someone is struggling or they've shared something really hard, what do we want to do? We want to fix it. We want to make it better. And what we know is that that doesn't help anything. It's the true connection in creating empathy. And sometimes we don't necessarily need to say or do anything at all, but just simply being with a person is what they need in that moment. Sometimes when we're creating empathy, it isn't about a person that just shared something hard with us. It's different, because it's us as leaders needing to have a hard conversation with someone. Have a hard conversation with them about maybe our work or their performance. And so sometimes empathy is needed in a tough conversation, not to connect to the hard thing that the other person is necessarily feeling, but in order to connect to them so that we can communicate what is needed in the moment. In other words, sometimes we need to give advice. Sometimes we need to support them. But yet that's not what empathy is. In other words, empathy is not fixing, solving, advice giving, or being the one-upper. The one-upper is, you think that's bad, let me tell you about me, and changing the focus on me. So what if you do have to have a hard conversation, and maybe it's about performance, maybe it's with a child or partner or friend, you have to have a hard conversation with someone, and within the conversation, there needs to be some fixing, solving, and advice giving. But what I'm telling you here today is courageous leadership is leaning into your vulnerability and creating empathy, syncing up and not fixing, advice giving, or solving. How do you have a conversation about fixing, advice giving, and solving and create empathy? In other words, where does empathy fit in that conversation? I want you to have a short conversation at your table about that. Where does empathy fit in a tough conversation where you need to solve, fix, or give advice? Quick conversation at your table. I'm interested to hear what you say. Yeah, let's do your table first. He was bringing you the mic.
Yeah, so we talked about just starting with empathy, with if there's a difficult conversation, just to kind of start in that place of connection from the very beginning, either through maybe a personal example of, no, this might be a hard conversation. I've been in this place too. Here's what I found, or just really, I think just trying to kind of connect and disarm that other person from the very beginning, or even just giving an example of somebody else who might be similar, but to down into constructive, like how can we solve this problem? What the things do you see, just collaborating on a solution together?
Yeah, and your first sentence was spot on, 100%. Where does empathy fit? You start with it. You take the advice giving, you take all the things you have in your head that you need to tell them, and you put it aside and you focus on creating empathy first. And those were some great examples of how to do that. And so the advice giving, everything that you have on your agenda, the emotion and create empathy first. What would you like to add to that?
Yeah, that's really similar to what we said.
Yeah.
Sometimes we think it's appropriate to give space.
Yes.
Maybe you're not the person to speak into it at that moment, especially if it's something that's really raw, like a loss or something like that. Letting them kind of deal with things before you even try and insert yourself into the situation. But then trying to understand how that person feels and not projecting your own emotions on the right circumstance.
Yeah, being really aware of their environment, physical environment, what's happening, but also their emotional environment, where they are and what's the best time to approach. So giving space is great. And it also offers space to get rid of some of the reactivity that might be present for either of you. What else would we add to that? Yeah, let's go to the back. Let's hear online.
Meet someone where they are emotionally and give them your focus and ear during a conversation and tell them that this is hard for you to do.
Yeah, this is hard for you too. What about our last two tables? What would you add to that?
Honestly, it was pretty much the same. We talked about how in the beginning, like you show the empathy, and that's where like it fits, like listening and everything, and then words like in maybe more collaborative discussion to help solve.
Yeah, so empathy is first, and then we move into collaboration, that we're both in this together, and how do we move forward as a team? So Chris, are you our leader now? It was your turn, right?
I'm the spokesperson now. So we went straight to having a conversation with someone without saying fixing, solving, and advice giving. And the three of us are fixers, and we're not sure how to do that. But what we arrived at, Andrea made a point of, maybe we're, in the jungle when really this person is in the desert, and what it boils down to is we're missing their point and where they're coming from. So starting there would help us have a conversation where we didn't try and immediately fix it.
Right. And it's so hard, isn't it, for those of us that are fixers? And even in my occupation, I was trained to be the expert and tell people what to do. And it's really hard to not jump into fixing when you really feel like, I got the answer. I know what you need to do. But unfortunately, that creates some boundaries for us. It puts up walls with the other person. And creating empathy first, and then being able to use words that help them feel more empowered around the decisions and the conversations, and create more collaboration, is a lot more effective. It can be more time consuming. It can feel harder for us because it will require some courage to keep quiet, not give them the answer. But I think what it creates is what we're seeking today, is we're seeking connection with other people and seeking understanding. And so I'm going to give you some language to use. This is language to help you with creating empathy first. It's simple things like, it sounds like you're feeling, I would feel blank in that situation too. So what I hear you saying is, and repeating back to them, what you're saying makes so much sense. And finally, how can I support you? And one of my favorite, I do some emotional well-being coaching, and I do leadership coaching, and I have 2 teenage boys. And in situations where I'm feeling like I just don't even know what to say in this moment, sometimes just saying that, wow, that's a lot. I'm just not even sure what to say. Or my favorite go-to is, tell me more. And so once we've established empathy and some connection, and we feel like there it is, we synced up to the emotion, I get that emotion, I felt that emotion before, how can we now lead people into the conversation about what needs to be accomplished? And here's some more language that can help you do that. Now, this comes from emotional well-being coaching. This comes from leadership coaching. This comes from Dare to Lead and Courageous Leadership. But it's just open-ended questions that can help the other person feel more empowered. What does support from me look like? How do you feel about? Tell me more. What's the real challenge here for you? What's most valuable for you here? What personal strengths do you have that would help you succeed? That was one that my leader said to me a lot that was incredibly helpful in empowering me in making change. How does your behavior fit with your values? How would you like for things to be different? The story I'm making up, help me to understand. And finally, if we were successful, what would this look like for you? So what do you think about these types of questions when you're leaning into tough conversations and we need to fix or give advice? What do you think happens when you create empathy first and then lead with these types of questions? Absolutely. So it's another support for creating more psychological safety and trust. What do you think? So I'll share with you that when you lead with a lot of these open-ended questions and you're taking the time and energy to hear from them, usually the thing that you want to give them advice about bubbles to the surface in their own words. And so now they've created the conversation and the idea, and you're able to contribute to that, and they feel empowered because it's not you shooting all over them or telling them what to do. It's them coming up with their own idea and you collaboratively moving forward together. Sure. You know, I think it's a great question to do when you've done some work on values. So when the team has already done work on values of the team, individual values, and how you can operationalize them and turn them into behaviors, it's a much easier conversation to have because people in the room or the person you've talked to, they've identified their top two values with each other and how they live into them. And so it sounds and feels more like a curious question instead of we've never talked about values before. And how does your behavior fit with your, like it seems a little off course. So it works best when you've had those types of conversations, which are really, really helpful because I'll tell you from doing values work, and I've done values work with very, very large groups and very small groups, it almost never happens that two people in the same room have the same values. We all have different values. And if we're going to turn values into behavior, that means our behaviors might be very, very different. And when we can seek to understand behind what people's values and behaviors are, we're able to connect better with each other. One of the main things that I've learned in this work that has been so helpful for me in hard conversations and being vulnerable is to remember that feedback is a function of respect. Feedback is a function of respect. So when I'm delivering feedback and I can remember that there's a reason I'm here having to have this hard conversation, it's because in one way or another, I respect this person. So I can lead with empathy, connect to the emotion they're feeling, and then get into the conversation around why I respect them and why this conversation is important. Feedback as a gift, it is a function of respect. So one of the last things I'm going to ask you to do today, this is a highlight of everything we've learned, is to drill it down to one thing. What did you hear today? Do you want to lean into that call to courage? Do you want to share and lead more with that best self vision? We learned about permission slips as a great way to create presence, focus, and trust, an easy one you can bring back to your team. You can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And so that feeling of uncertainty and emotional exposure is part of being courageous, because although we feel fear or weakness, it looks like courage in other people when we see it. We learned about your best self vision as a leader. We learned the truth about your best self. We talked about a call to courage, defined and explored empathy, and we talked about empathy in conversation. So it is your turn. What did you learn today? What is one thing that you could use from today and move forward and do differently that would support you in your own courageous leadership? So I'll give you a moment to write that down. That is your last question on your worksheet. So as we're closing out today, it's really important to have some accountability around this one big thing that you're going to choose to focus on. So you can choose to share with someone in the room. You can choose to share with someone when you get back to work. You can choose to share with someone at home, but just sharing with them that this is what I learned and this is what I'm going to try and focus on moving forward. I want to share one last story with you before I conclude. I had an experience recently. I do a lot of courageous leadership work with NASA. And I've done a number of different trainings with them over the last year. And the majority of my audience is engineers. And probably 90 to 95% of them are men. And we were having a conversation about vulnerability and how it feels so scary. And yet it's the courageous thing to do. And I had a female in my class. She was the only one in the room. And she raised her hand and she said, "But what do you do when vulnerability goes wrong?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Sometimes those feelings of fear and the things that go through my head about what people will think and what people will say, I choose to step into the arena. I choose to be vulnerable. And all those things I fear happen. They hold it against me. They say mean things, and it just doesn't work." And I think that's going to happen. It absolutely will, because there are people who are not in the arena with you. And my favorite quote from Brene Brown that I think does a great job at explaining what happens in those situations. This is from Brene. "If you are not in the arena getting your ass kicked, I'm not interested in or open to your feedback. There are a million cheap seats in the world today filled with people who will never be brave with their own lives, but will spend every ounce of energy they have hurling advice and judgment at those of us being courageous. Their only contributions are criticism, cynicism, and fear-mongering. If you are criticizing from a place where you are not also in the arena, I am not interested in your feedback." And so those times are hard. The most courageous ones of us have scars to prove it, but we can live through them by recognizing that we stepped into the arena and it was through our own integrity and our own values that we did it. So I want to thank all of you for being here with me today. I'm going to hand it back over and let you close us out.
Let's give her a round of applause for spending this morning with us. And what great tools for us to take into our workplace, and just really encouraging. And thank you for teaching us how to use some of these tools here today for ourselves and as leaders, trying it out when you go back to work. If not today, later this week or next week. But certainly, thank you, Natalie.